Well, everyone, thank you for joining us today and welcome. This is ACRL Presents Ethical Engagement in Learning Analytics, Lessons Learned by Campus Colleagues. Please place any questions you have for the presenters in the Q&A box at the end of the session and they will be addressed. After the presentation, a recording, the slides, and an evaluation survey will be sent to all registrants. And finally, this is a free webcast, and this and other free professional development opportunities are made possible in part by your ACRL membership, which helps fund many of our programs and services for the academic and research library community. Not a member? Consider joining nearly 10,000 of your colleagues by visiting ala.org/ACRL/membership. Thank you again for being here today, and panelists, feel free to begin when you're ready. Megan, I think you're on mute.
Yep, I am. But I wanted to get that out of the way for everybody. All right, so thank you all for getting us started, and thank you, Becky, for getting our slides up. So I want to welcome all of you, our presenters, my co-moderators, Becky Croxton and Chungmi Schoolis, the hosting committees, the ACRL Value of Academic Libraries Committee, and the ACRL Professional Values Committee, and of course, all of you who are attending today. Thanks for spending some time with us on this very important topic, ethical engagement in learning analytics. Next slide, please. Thank you. Given the increasing focus on learning analytics across higher education and the central role of libraries in teaching and learning, librarians are increasingly considering their role in learning analytics. At some institutions, library engagement in learning analytics is already underway, and at others, learning analytics remains a topic of library discussions with no action undertaken as yet. At many of our institutions, other campus units have been developing learning analytics initiatives for a decade or more. We in libraries can benefit from understanding what those who have been immersed in this work have learned, what challenges they have confronted, and what successes they've achieved. And so today we wanted to bring to our library audience several recognized experts in this space who can share with us both their own experiences and those they're aware of nationally in this work. We've asked them specifically to focus on the ethical aspects of learning analytics and the role it plays in supporting and providing student agency in learning. So we hope this panel discussion will help you achieve a few outcomes. First, anticipate and respond to challenging areas of discussion with your library colleagues about learning analytics. Identify major concerns that should be addressed in any project or proposal that involves personally identifiable information, and to begin creating an ethical framework for using student data at your own libraries. Slide, please. Thanks. For the purpose of our webinar here today, here's our simplified definition of learning analytics. Learning analytics is the use of institutional level systems that collect individual level student learning and engagement data, centralize it in a record store, and strive to serve as a unified source for research seeking to understand and support student success. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Becky for our ground rules.
Thanks, Megan. So today we're embarking on a discussion that may involve sensitive topics in the field right now. There is some disagreement about whether we should be doing this work or the possible negative impact of this work on students or vulnerable populations. We acknowledge the necessity of being aware of these concerns and want to be open to listening to all points of view so that it may result in best practices and productive directions for the work being done in libraries. Thus, we've outlined these ground rules you see on your screen. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our four panelists today. First, we have Saul Bermann. Saul is the Executive Director of Information Assurance and Chief Information Security Officer for the University of Michigan. Saul is responsible for the university's information assurance, including IT security, privacy, IT policy, compliance, and enterprise community. For purposes of this program, he has also been heavily involved in university data governance and the development of U of M's learning analytics guiding principles. And he has provided a link here for additional information related to his biography. I'm also pleased to welcome Dr. Natasha Jankowski, who is a higher education and assessment consultant. Dr. Jankowski is the former executive director of the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment, often referred to as NILOA, and previously served as a research associate professor with the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana. She is currently senior fellow with Strata Education Network and a lecturer for New England College and Endicott College. Welcome, Natasha. And Natasha has also provided a link to a more comprehensive profile. Next, I'm pleased to welcome John McDonald to our panel. John is the director of product management for analytics at EBSCO Information Services. In this role, John works with libraries to provide advanced decision-making support and intelligence tools for library data. He has led the development of EBSCO's Panorama, a newly released modern library analytics platform combining different library and campus data to enable insights that were not possible until now. In previous roles, John has served as an academic research librarian for over 25 years in a variety of roles, including AUL, library director, and CIO. Welcome, John. And finally, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Kathe Pelletier. With more than 20 years of experience in higher education with positions in areas such as academic advising, learning assistance, curriculum design, and competency-based education. Kathe currently holds the role of Director of the Teaching and Learning Program with EDUCAUSE. She brings an expertise by combining traditional higher education best practice with innovative delivery models. Through her career, Kathe has accomplished such things as competency-based curriculum model that became an anchor for a self-paced CBE program, developing and launching a holistic assessment and outreach system that delivered personalized resource recommendations to incoming students, and optimizing a faculty community of practice that was not only engaging and satisfying to the faculty participants, but also increased student learning outcomes and success metrics. And once again, I encourage you to read the bios of all of our panelists. We're so happy that you're here. Today's discussion is going to be centered around 5 key topic areas: students, guiding ideas, personal information, getting started, and consequences of inaction. And with that, I'm going to toss it back over to Megan.
Thank you, Becky. So I get to ask the first question, and I'm pretty excited about that. So here's the question. It's actually a 2-parter, of course, because we had to make it complex. So how have you observed learning analytics being used to make a difference for students, both generally and specifically populations that have been traditionally marginalized? Who would you say are leaders in this space of harnessing learning analytics data to make improvements for and with students? Natasha, I'm going to ask you to go first.
Thanks so much, Megan, and welcome everyone. So delighted to be part of this really important conversation that continues to evolve over time, which is good to then be in dialogue and thinking and speaking about it. The perspective that I bring to answering this question is really coming from the lens of assessment and thinking about, from that definition that was shared, what's happening at an institutional level to really support student success. And so I want to give a big picture before others kind of share thinking deeper into what's going on within library spaces and what some of those might be. So there's a lot that's been going on in the learning analytics space, whether you're thinking about it from machine learning or natural language processing or data mining or whatever that might be, but honing in on the learning analytics, there's a ton of work on thinking about how do we help and support students to guide them better through our institutions to ensure that they're getting the targeted needs supported at the moment that they need it. And so thinking about how do we do just-in-time help and supported resources. And a lot of that is happening in the learning space, things about like nudging, things about early alerts to alert when do we need to have an advisor, someone to come in and connect. And so when you think about the other spaces that this is happening throughout, chatbots, tons of work in testing, which is a different controversial subject we can talk about another time if anyone is interested. But when we think about what's going on to really support our most marginalized student population, some of this is helping support suggesting learning resources. What would be most helpful to get to you at the moment of time in a course that you're in to advance a question that you have? If there is already bias in our system, getting to a point of pushing that out is not going to address that in a different way. But you can think about what's the range for things around decision-making support. What do I need to know about how students are utilizing our different resources, our offices, our functional units? What times do they use those? When do I need to have additional support staff available to them? Which students need longer support time? So I need to make sure that I have appropriate staff to meet our student needs. Thinking about that institutional decision piece and efficiencies on that end. From a student perspective, I want to know something about how long do students spend time looking at particular resources? Which ones do they find most helpful and beneficial? Which ones are they not paying attention to and ignoring? And that's something that I think is really important for them to do. How do I need to get it in front of them at a time that matters? If I'm not looking at engagement patterns with that, I have a much harder time talking to our students. When I think about where to the student piece is being involved very actively, just keeping it very high level picture, is thinking about the discussion of how our students move through curriculum in ways of resources they need over time. For instance, if I'm a faculty member and I'm teaching a course and I have a certain amount of time where students are asked to engage with resources and they're actually engaging with it for a longer period of time, I need to know that to think about my instructional design, think about my course timing, or to even think about a programmatic linking over time to say this is something we need to keep running into in a different course sequence, or think about how we chunk it differently. Without understanding those engagement patterns of the time and the resources spent with related to that, I don't know. But as a student, I want to know, to make my search process easier, what are the resources that other students trust to answer these questions? Where are the places that they're going? If I really engage with a particular type of resource in a particular type of form, what are the things in the course that I'm in that are closest to that can meet my current needs in this space? What have been my patterns of engagement and understanding how I'm relating to the resources, how I'm engaging with these spaces, and where do I need to have something to change potentially my behavior or think differently about how I'm engaging in that? Or even where is it that I want to have pushed to me something that's completely different, that I want to choose my own adventure and I need something that's completely outside of the other places that I've engaged in before. And so I want you to look at my past behavior patterns and then give me something that's completely a new source and a potential area for me. So think about it as a choose your own adventure opportunity there. To do that, we need people at various places, ensuring that information can come together to make it work. But that's for another time. But it's going to answer so many questions we have about students, but also decision making that we have at the institution level from a big picture.
I'm always in support of choosing one's own adventure. So I appreciate that. Kathe, did you have anything you wanted to add to this question?
Yeah, thank you. And again, it's wonderful to be a part of this conversation. I'm going to actually take it up even a higher level than Natasha just did and really look at the dynamics across higher education and at the institutional level that enable us to serve our students in a targeted way, especially those that have been previously and currently marginalized. We have a hot off the presses Horizon report on data and analytics that I will have a link later in the presentation that you can go check out. It's our first Horizon report related to data analytics. And if you're not familiar with our Horizon reports, we invite an expert panel to work with us to identify trends that are shaping higher education, and then the technologies and practices that the panel believes is going to be really critical to be successful in the future in dealing with these trends. And so I want to spend a little bit of time on some of these trends and technologies and practices before I highlight a few examples of institutions that are doing these things and taking the actions now that can really serve in support of this kind of learning analytics in service of students. So just a handful of the trends that were identified. It's interesting to see the tension between them. So we have one trend identified the panel related to institutions really being asked to support their decisions with data, whether it's learning data, engagement data, all sorts of kinds of data. But we also know that a trend that we're seeing is that many of these big data methods are actually reinforcing inequality. So that's also currently happening at the same time. Meanwhile, conversations like this about the ethical use of data and learning analytics are also increasing. And so we're kind of noticing as a field that these inequalities are happening, especially in big data, and we're seeking to find ways to address them. So that's really promising. But the less than promising stuff, and the place that I really want to encourage us, especially those folks who come to EDUCAUSE for resources and support, are that our existing data infrastructures and governance processes are outdated. We're still really struggling to kind of develop these foundational policies and practices related to how we collect and analyze and use our data. And our staff are still behind in data literacy and AI skills that are really critical for the rapid adoption of this kind of analytics. And meanwhile, our data privacy laws are becoming even more and more complicated with individual states creating their own privacy laws in the US being different than internationally. And so it's very complex. But meanwhile, I think I've said meanwhile about 5 times. Meanwhile, there are a lot of things that we can be doing right now to be preparing and establishing foundations to be able to serve students ethically and equitably. So things like investing in modern data architecture, data governance. I know these things are really at the institutional level and may not be as interesting to library professionals, but they are conversations that as library professionals, you can and should be a part of. So I really encourage you to invite yourself to those meetings, to really prompt your CIO and your other colleagues to engage you in these conversations so that that you're representing the library perspective. Certainly paying attention to DEI training as it relates to data and analytics is another critical piece too. So that's just a super high level touch on what the baseline and the foundational things are that are really critical for this work. But I want to show you some shining star examples of institutions that are doing a really good job in some of these areas. One I would highlight in Australia, actually at the University of Queensland. They have an awesome site that I can post a link in the chat after I'm done talking, where their entire data governance approach is centered in ethics. And so they have resources for their staff, they have policies and process, and it's a very, very well developed approach. And it includes, very granular things like how they approach data sharing agreements, and how they really build competency in their staff. So collectively, the culture is focused on ethical use of data. They have the skills training that they need, and they have the processes to support it. So that's a great example. Another aspect of this work is transparency, and I know we're going to talk a little bit about that in a little bit. But students really deserve to know how their data is being used, right? Especially if it's anything that is going to identify them either personally or as a group. And Georgia State University is doing a lot of things. They're known for their kind of innovative use of technology, but they're working on integrating 20 separate systems that combine data, student data across online and in-person interactions, and it's really enabling them to get in front of issues and intervene to improve student success and retention. And so they have actually done one small thing, but I think it is an example of ideas that you can do that don't require significant infrastructure or change, but they've added in their registration agreement for students information about how that data is being used and how it's being collected, and so students have the opportunity to understand and be aware of that. I have one more example that I want to share, and that is related to actually kicking it up a notch, not just the ethical use of data, but also in terms of do no harm. So we don't want to inadvertently hurt people, but some institutions are actually ratcheting that up to think about how they're using analytics in order to serve their diversity, equity, and inclusion goals more proactively. And so one institution that's doing that is the University of California, Merced. And their strategy for that is that they have an embedded data analyst that works both in the IR office. She has a dotted line to the institutional research office, but she sits in their diversity, equity, inclusion office, and she serves as a translator for at the highest level for the president. She's kind of the data whisperer, and she can do things like talk about how do we tell stories of these students? These are individual humans that we're talking about. These are not numbers. How can we have more patience for the qualitative data that sometimes is really a better way to understand what students are experiencing and what they need, instead of relying on dashboards and numbers, especially when it's difficult to disaggregate the data to a level that is meaningful. And doesn't inadvertently expose certain students, and really building the scaffolding for your data infrastructure and setting expectations. So that bridge role is something that seems to be really successful in bringing the equity into the conversation. I have a number of other examples I'd be happy to share, but I will pass it off to my next colleague here.
Thanks. I really appreciate that, Kathe, about the piece of, it's not too late to make an individual contribution, right? In terms of like the terrain is not settled and we can still make changes, lots of them, because we're in the middle of these things. And also the focus on students as individuals, not as, elements in a spreadsheet, so to speak. All right. And John, I think you wanted to touch on this as well. I want to hear what you have to say.
Great. Thank you, Megan. And I'm also thankful to be here with everybody today. And I'm going to take it from the institutional level back down to the library level in regards to library involvement in learning analytics projects. And so among libraries that I've talked to, there are many that are very interested in having that library involvement in learning analytics, because they see that learning analytics projects are probably going to happen at their institutions regardless of whether they participate or not. So they want to make sure their data is represented and they're not invisible, but also for specific projects. So one library that I work with is interested in the institutional early intervention program. And so students that are failing to thrive early on in their academic career, there's an intervention program at the institutional level, and this library has a personal librarian program. So they want to make sure that they're involved with that, and that librarian is paired with those students so they can improve their success. Another institution that we work with, an elite institution that's not necessarily worried about early intervention. They don't have a lot of students that fail to thrive, but what they're interested in is making good students even better. So they want to identify those areas of library engagement that students might not be taking advantage of and introduce them to them. And it might not be on an individual level. They might want to find out if there's a particular demographic of student that is not engaging with the library, and then implement a marketing program or reach out to faculty for additional library involvement in particular courses. And as Kathe pointed out, the rest of the world, to some degree, involvement in learning analytics with the library is sort of a de facto proposition, especially in areas like countries like Australia and most of the UK, where doing these types of projects is almost codified into best practices, guidelines, and laws.
Thank you so much, John. So my time for that question is over. I have to hand it off to Jung-mi.
Great, thank you, Megan. So the next topic is related to the guiding ideas. So the question is, what policies, tools, standards, or guidelines do you use as touchstones in your learning analytics thinking or projects? Sol, would you like to start first?
Sure. So it struck me as we listened to the wonders of learning analytics that it sounds an awful lot like Amazon or Google hoovering up all the information about you and then telling you that it's good for you after the fact. And that was my first sort of inclination when I started in this space at the University of Michigan. University of Michigan is a fairly early adopter of learning analytics. Like, I don't know, John, which university you're referencing, but University of Michigan, generally our students thrive, and we wanted to figure out A, how we can get them to thrive even more, and B, how we can actually improve the teaching end too. So when I first joined about 10 years ago, one of the first tasks I had with my privacy hat on was talking through what learning analytics meant. And it was easy for me to be skeptical, as I mentioned. It sounds a lot like Google and Amazon doing good things for you. But as I got to understand the space more and the people who are part of the space, the differentiator between the private sector and higher ed is there for a reason. It's the reason I'm in higher ed, which doesn't mean that there aren't risks and concerns about how we appropriately collect, share, use, and create improvements in student outcomes based on this data. So first thing we did, we actually said, is there any laws or policies at the University of Michigan that would prohibit this? And the interesting thing about learning analytics, and it has become a pet topic for me in many ways, is because it falls through some cracks. So if you think about it from a human subject research perspective, the common rule doesn't cover it, because this is research that's ostensibly being done to improve teaching, learning, and education at your institution. FERPA doesn't cover it for basically the same reasons. And we didn't have any university policy that said, well, we can't do this. It doesn't mean that we just dove in and said, okay, let's have a free-for-all. We actually took a step back and said, just because we can, should we? And if we say we should, then what are some guardrails we can create around how we're going to do this? And so we developed very early on some learning analytics guiding principles that were based on best practices in privacy and information practices, based on some emerging ethics trends that we were seeing within the learning analytics space. And we to the extent they're codified at the University of Michigan, we codified them as a place to start and as a touchstone for our researchers and our faculty members who are engaged in this. Over time, we've done more in the transparency space, and I know we're going to talk about that later. But we've developed a actual website that explains to students the data we collect, how it's used, and where appropriate, how to take agency over some of that data's usage. So I'll stop there, but as we dive in, these guiding ideas, these guiding principles are foundational to how you should go about this work in a way that doesn't freak out the students and make sure that it is student-centric first.
Great, thank you, Saul. It's always helpful to know how other libraries, how other universities actually implement the learning analytics. And then, as you said, it was a skeptical, but as time goes by, you encountered a lot of challenges and it overcomes as well. So the next is John. Would you like to share your opinion about this question?
Yes, thank you. I think it's important. Saul mentioned a couple of things like federal, state, and international regulations. So all of those are important guidelines and tools for institutions to use. So at EBSCO, all of our products are compliant with things like FERPA, HIPAA for the health products, and ISO 27001, as well as international regulations like GDPR and Privacy Shield. But those are only guidelines, and we encourage customers and potential customers, librarians that we talk to really review those, because there's an unevenness of understanding of those things. So, some might say, oh, you can't collect any student data because that violates FERPA. And that's not actually the case. That's not what FERPA says. So we encourage everybody to use those standards and international and national standards as their guidelines. But more importantly, I believe that human insight, human oversight on what you're doing with your engagement data is absolutely critical. So just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do something, or just because you can do something in a certain way doesn't mean you want to do it in that way. You may want to do your research or gathering of data in a different way. So Specifically, one guideline that we ask customers to adhere to is to name a data protection officer among their staff. Most often, you know, a CIO or a VP in IT, someone that's experienced with data protection, data security, not just the technical aspects, but the human and the ethical aspects, that they can apply these international standards to their specific institution and then mold what they're doing to adhere to their local guidelines. So they're as comfortable as they can be with what they're doing regarding the collection of potentially private information and ensuring the protection of that data over the long term.
Thank you, John. Now my goal is to go back to my campus and find out who is our data protection officer. Thank you so much. Next, Kathe.
Yeah, so I feel like, you know, John's example and Saul's example as well are great illustrations of an individual campus or individual campuses doing this work and creating policies or principles that they enact at their campus. I think we have a great opportunity to interpret these federal international compliance guidelines at a field-wide level and create, you know, suggestions or guidelines that we can collectively kind of get behind, certainly with nuance for the individual institutional context, because there's always a reason, you know, making sure that you're aligned with your university mission, the needs of your students, et cetera. But I do think there are some starting points out there for these kinds of principles. And I'm going to highlight some principles from the Every Learner Everywhere Learning Analytics Strategy Toolkit. And actually, Natasha Jankowski was one of the contributors to that, so she may be able to speak to these in more detail. But I thought that they're still very high level, but I think they start to get at the ethical aspect and the equity orientation that learning analytics systems really need to consider. So the first one is to explicitly set and communicate institutional level goals to achieve equity in academic outcomes across student groups, including students of color and low-income students through the use of learning analytics. And so really putting the students in the center, making sure your equity goals are and your ethical goals are really explicit, and there are things that you're holding yourself accountable to is really important. I mentioned this earlier that we're lagging behind, our staff are lagging behind in data literacy skills and other technical skills needed to support learning analytics systems. So the second principle is related to ensuring professional development and ongoing support across stakeholders to implement, analyze, and act on data. And that ongoing support is really critical because we all know that the tools and the technologies and the use cases are continuously changing at a really quick pace. And so making sure that it's not just a one and done thing that, you know, I trained my staff one day and now they're done. We have to really make sure that it's an ongoing conversation and commitment. The third one is kind of related to some of the things that John and Saul already mentioned, but establishing and communicating institutional data policies about the use of student data, but going beyond FERPA. So, you know, making sure that there are policies related to the use of student data on your campus, make sure that your staff and other stakeholders, and including students, are aware of what those are. Those policies should include fidelity and responsible use, consent and privacy, and data transparency. So those are really critical elements. The fidelity and responsible use, consent and privacy, and data transparency are really cornerstones of those policies that you might be developing and then communicating. And then finally, making sure that the technology and infrastructure actually eases the ability for users to leverage student data. And this reflects the kind of foundational commitment to data governance and data infrastructure, that it's not just a light switch that you turn on, that it's both having the technology in place, developing the right skill set among your users and stakeholders, and then having a culture oriented around this kind of data use, and making sure that you're outlining and communicating procedures for when you're acquiring new education and analytics technology, to make sure that you're seamlessly integrating it with your existing infrastructure. Those pipes, as basic as they are in the background, are really important to make sure that you're able to effectively use the data that you have access to. So, from the perspective of the library, you might say, yeah, but we're just over here and we have these specific data sources. Well, you might actually be able to have a much more ethical approach to your data use from the library systems if you're better connected to the other university systems. So the more that you can consider that kind of across the institution integration, and do that while you're thinking about procuring the technology, not after you've already purchased it, is really important. So so those are the policies, or the principles that are in the Every Learner Analytics toolkit. And as I mentioned, it's linked in the resources that you'll see later on in the slides. There's lots of other great stuff in that resource as well.
Thank you, Kathe, for highlighting 4 principles of learning analytics. Now we have Natasha. Can you please add more?
Sure, thank you so much. So I hope you've gotten so far from sort of the conversation that Saul shared and the thoughtful process for developing guiding principles within an institution. And John and Kathe mentioned in other things like the work that's happened in Australia and UK, and Kathe thinking about like the guiding principle on equity, but there's a lot out there to think about, to pull from and inform what you want to do and do. So if you're going like, no one's thinking about this, like there's a lot of people thinking about this, and it is not something. I think that the 2 key points that I want to make, and is just to wrap it up, is these are not conversations that are happening to you, but there are tons of opportunities to be a part of the conversation or lead in this conversation space. Most of these are consortiums of concerned people coming together to say, how do we do this in a way that is very thoughtful and mindful and that is student-centered? And so back to our friends in the UK, I think to doing this where you're not going, we know what students need and what concerns they have, but actively involving students in the conversations around these issues are key. So there's a National Union of Students in the UK that actually developed policies on student rights. So it's over 600 student unions that came together to say, what do we as students want to have? What ownership do I want to have? What opportunities do I want to have? What does this mean to me in this space? And I think where we can think about taking things from other guiding principles into ours is, where do we ensure that as we're going and taking all this wonderful information on principles that can form our work, that we're doing it with students at the center, and that student voices are central to that. If you are interested in being a part of these conversations, I would also point you to the IMS Global Learning Consortium. It's now EdTech One, or One EdTech or something. I apologize if I'm doing it wrong, but it's a nonprofit member organization that's really about creating standards. So if we need to have something like, what are the standards that we want? And then how can we have software review these standards so that they're in compliance for it? And we were like, okay, you've been certified in alignment with these standards and these principles. And so as you're going around saying, like, I have these concerns, you can look to see which are the standards related to that. There's learning data analytics key principles that they have through that consortium. They have a highlight of effective practices in this space that you should ensure any software you're working with does that. And so there are also groups that are keeping an eye on what is happening in the space and is it moving in that positive direction. So please do turn to those communities or be active in those communities to voice your concern and see how they're addressing it, and which principles make most sense to your local context and your student population.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing those resources. So now we are moving to the next topic, and I will hand over this to Becky.
Thank you all. What a fun conversation so far. So this next set of questions is the ever existent conversation around personally identifiable information. Many librarians feel that any data that includes students' personally identifiable information, or PII, should not be gathered, stored, used, or etc. This comes from a long-standing ALA code of ethics issues, or concerns related to privacy about what people are doing related to library resources, services, and spaces. So how have you dealt with these conversations in the past, perhaps with libraries or in other circles across your campuses or at universities? Kathe, would you like to kick us off?
Sure, yeah, and I am sharing the perspective of students as they've told us in a not quite yet published, so this is before hot off the presses, not quite yet published research report related to students and their experiences with technology. And we have a section related to digital learning, and we also will have a section related to students and privacy. So this is a really interesting issue from the perspective of students because, and this year's results on the survey are very consistent with past years when we've asked this question or this type of question. Students are extremely comfortable with the general idea of data being collected about them. However, when you ask them about the institutional use of data about them, students get a lot more nervous. And so it's like they think they're okay with it in concept, but then when it comes to actually like, oh yeah, but I'm not so sure about that thing if it relates to me specifically in this specific situation. We also are finding in this research that students don't actually know how their information is being used and collected on their campuses. And they don't know how it's stored and protected. They don't know how it's used. I'll share some quotes from some of our respondents. Some believe that their institution doesn't use any data about them, which we know is obviously not true. One quote is, "I don't think they use it. Why would they need my personal data beyond identifying me for buying stuff and registration?" So that's one student. Another student says, "I don't think they sell it. I don't even know what kind of personal data they have." And other responses were less about how it was used and more about the type of information collected. So things like demographics was an example of a response. So students aren't very well informed about how their data is used. There were other responses that reflected a much more sophisticated understanding. So I don't mean to suggest that all responses were in this vein, but certainly enough for us to report on this type of student reaction. So again, kind of underscoring the need to really be intentional, not intentional about data literacy, not just with your staff, but with students as well, and being transparent about your data privacy practices, how you are and how you're not using their data, and really being a resource for them. We also found in the survey that students were most likely, like 42% of students responded that they learned about this, about data privacy and security from their institution, that was their main resource that they went to versus just looking on the internet, talking to friends and family, et cetera. So the institution itself can be an amazing source to help students better understand how their data is being used. But I think that there is this kind of ongoing lack of trust between students and institutions related to the institution's data practice. And so it's certainly an area, regardless of, I think as librarians are thinking about using personally identifiable data, this is something, no matter how it is or isn't used, I think the transparency and the engagement with students in the conversation about it is a really critical piece. So I'll turn it over to the next panelist.
Thank you so much, Kathe. John, would you be able to share your perspectives?
Yeah, thanks, Becky. And to reinforce what Kathe said, librarians know that librarians have always collected PII. We needed to know who you were so we could give you our stuff and we could get it back. The simplest thing like circulating a book. But we also always tried to protect it to the best of our ability. And it's that view that I think should overlay learning analytics at the institutional level as well. So if librarians are involved in learning analytics at the start, it better positions them to inform what's happening in those projects and to better protect the data and to ensure and to bring up issues around the ethical use of data, and maybe not even only the ethical use of data, but the moral use of that data. So if your institution's going to do learning analytics anyways, we might as well position librarians at the forefront of those projects. And also to quote Megan Oakleaf, or to paraphrase something Megan said at a meeting I was at once. She said, there's no assumption of anonymity in the faculty-student compact in higher education. As your instructor, the more I know about who you are, your goals, your challenges, your intended path, the better I can teach you and support your progress. And I think that translates really well into the library data side, the library use of data, to ensure as a librarian, the more I know about you, the better I can serve you and tailor my services and collections to meet and encourage your success.
Gave me goosebumps, John. Thanks. Natasha, did you have anything you'd like to share?
Sure. I think one of the things that's important, and I'm coming at this from the assessment perspective, and is students want to know what personal information is going to be used to what end. So this is where use cases become incredibly important. And when you get into assessment, there's a ton of concern around student artifacts. You know, what are people going to do with them? Who gets to see them? Who has access? Is this part of my permanent record? At what point in a learning journey do you not want to see things that I did before? Or when do you want something to see now? And I think it's the nuance within that is understanding which decisions are people comfortable with when it comes to access. Like, it's okay for students if you're like, if you're going to help faculty better engage with me and better target their resources, go for it. Use it for that. If this is to figure out like how to make sure I spend more money in the dining hall, you know, like Big Brother Amazon. So I was talking about like less interested in that from a student perspective. If it's about helping know what's working and what's not, and then helping me navigate in real time when I need that help as a student to the resources that matter, to the formative assessments that will get me there, then yes, please use that information to go. But that means that we have to have a conversation around transparency and clear use cases in mind of what we're going to do with it, that we're not sort of like, give us some stuff and we'll look and figure out what might be helpful in this regard. And so the other thing to think about this as well on that student personal information piece is providing options to students. And I think there's a lot of students coming through K-12 that are used technology with personalized learning paths. They're used to having reflected about, particularly in an assessment area, what's going on with that helps me advance differently. And if there's a huge disconnect when they get into higher ed, we're like, nah, we don't do that. We can't help you when you're on your own. Like, it's a learning journey that you're taking a solo quest up this hill. Like, then we actually have different supports that we need to put in place to get with them. What we hear from the students, though, is that I want control over my record. I want to be able to push certain information out. I want to be able to stop certain groups from seeing information. And I want to be able to say, you know, if I think this has value to employer, you can have access to this bit. But I need somebody to help me. And so in assessment, what you see is professionals becoming very useful on assessment literacy for students. How do I make those decisions? If I'm going to have oversight of my own record in these ways, how do I make determinations of when to share, in what ways, and to whom, and what kind of access, and when do I revoke it? And so there's such a huge opportunity to think about the role librarians can play to really help people have information literacy on what do I need to do to be a good steward of my own record as a student. And I'm not sure I know of any other group that's really picking up and taking that. And so as we think about that personal sort of information piece, helping enable our students navigate this landscape is going to be a huge role that I think we can all help fill.
Thank you all for sharing those important perspectives. I just feel so empowered. Let's turn it over to Megan.
Thank you, Becky. So the next thing we wanted to have our speakers do is talk about how to get started. But what we ended up with was asking them about resources for getting started, because there's so much underlying each idea that we had. And so it sometimes takes more time. So on this slide, we have links to the resources that each one of our guest speakers suggested. We'll be sharing this out after the presentation so that you'll have this, as well as some other links that have come up in conversation. We'll be sure to include those as well. And I'm trying to keep an eye on the time and realizing that we do have one more question that we want to make sure everybody gets a chance to respond to. So I think we'll leave it at that. I was going to ask everyone to talk a little bit about their sources, but given the time, I want to pass that to the final question.
Thank you, Megan. I just about to say the time is flying by and we have only 10 minutes left. So this is the last question. So thank you everyone and panelists for sharing your opinions. Then when libraries decided not to engage in learning analytics at their institutions. What do you see as possible consequences? John, would you like to go first?
Yes, thanks. So some libraries have talked with us pretty extensively about the consequences of inaction. All the way from, kind of daily operational types of things along the lines of, am I a good steward of the collections budget that's been given to us? Are the resources that I'm buying being used in the to the greatest extent possible? So, having data about that kind of thing, that not only the inputs that go into the library and the outputs, but some are interested in what are the outcomes. So just because I spend so much money on online journals and these online journals were used to this degree, what was the outcome of that? Were my faculty more productive? Were my students achieving greater success? So you want to look, libraries want to look at what those correlations are, and not just at the collections level, but also at the services level, the resources level. You have a lot of librarians who teach classes and staff the buildings. Are students and faculty using those resources? And if not, how can you change those patterns to lead to greater success? So just one real stark example is a customer who bought into our product told us they needed our product 3 or 4 years ago, when faced with a budget crunch on campus. The library lost funding, they lost positions permanently, and then an organizational a reorganization of the institution led to them being placed under a different college, much to their detriment. And all of it, in their opinion, was because they didn't have a good handle on their library data, and they couldn't tell their story very well about how they were contributing to the overall educational mission of the institution.
Thank you, John. Natasha, would you like to add more about this?
Sure, thank you so much. And I have the real example in this comes from assessment, because we as assessment professionals did not get involved in learning analytics conversations early, much to our detriment. When you think about learning analytics and then there's no learning data in it, you're a bit like, wait, what? This is crazy. And part of that was this sort of, oh, it's too hard. Like, it's too hard to figure out which data, and we're not standardized, and what are we going to do? But the consequence of that is we aren't there. In the models that are made and any sort of predictive analytic works that come out, learning data then, if we weren't part of those conversations or struggling to figure out what does this make sense and go, aren't part of what we're doing to advance students. And so you're going, what if we're thinking about your learning advancement through an institution and that isn't an integral part of it? That's a huge detriment to the student, where they're just missing a blind spot with how they engage in education. Our institutions make decisions without that information. When we think about making the case for our value as assessment professionals beyond something like compliance reporting, it makes our ability to make the case much harder, because we're now further removed from students because we weren't initially in that conversation. And now we're playing this catch-up game where we're coming into the conversation later. We're trying to do all of this, the lingo has advanced, we're doing all these other parts. And we have early alert systems that are pushing to students. We're going, but you don't know why. You don't know why because you didn't have that conversation, because our data weren't apart. And so I say this as a cautionary tale of the importance of getting in my mind, I think those of us that sit where librarians and assessment people do, because we have a very unique position within the institution. No one else sees things in the way that we do. No one else plays nicely with others in the same way that we do as we look across the institution. That because of where we sit, we almost have an ethical responsibility to be a present in these conversations as opposed to disengage from it, because we are the ones that have a different interest at stake that matters to how we advance this for the institution. And so I'm seeing now what happened when we didn't, and we're now coming back into it. And so I invite you to join us in this so that you don't end up where we are in our sort of ongoing formative conversations in this space.
Excellent, thank you. Kathe, would you like to share your opinion with us?
Yeah, and I think I'm actually going to take this opportunity to address the question that's in the Q&A, which is kind of a flavor of this. So I'll read the question out loud and then provide a response. So the question is, I think you all can see the Q&A, but just in case not, The institutions whose students have the most to lose by unethical learning analytics practices, in other words, heavily surveilled BIPOC students, undocumented immigrants, or mixed status families, also tend to be the schools with the least IT resources to dedicate to data education and consent practices, and the most pressure to surveil students. How can poorly resourced institutions engage in ethical practices that require more staff and effort? I think this is a really, really critical question. And I don't have an easy answer, but I will say that certainly there is a technology aspect to learning analytics, and there are things that you need to purchase typically in order to do this work that is actual technology. And also not underplaying the resources need for that staff time and effort, as in the less well-resourced institutions, many staff are wearing multiple hats, and there isn't a lot of just extra time for this kind of professional development. But I will say that the cultural aspects of this work are so critical. Creating bridges between the technology and the analytics teams that you do have with any of your DEI offices is really important. Finding ways to look at what you are doing from an analytics perspective and make sure that there are policies that are clearly addressed. And one thing that I think is, again, not easy, but is really important for any institution, and that is to actually talk to the students about your findings. We have a great podcast on one of our showcases on our website, and Jonathan Gagliardi from the SUNY system said something really compelling, and it's that sometimes our analytics findings are logical to us, but if we ask students if they make sense to them, then they can actually say, actually, no, that's not what it feels like for me, or that's not what that means. And let me tell you what that actually means. And so that example is not necessarily for the types of learning analytics that Natasha has been describing, where it's, real-time feedback for students and actually getting in there while the student is in the learning process. But as we're using data to better understand students and what they need, those conversations are really, really critical. And I think that, for institutions that serve a large degree of BIPOC students or other students with special identities that really need to be protected and supported with fewer resources, those kinds of conversations are really critical to have.
Great, thank you, Kathe, for answering the audience question. And since we have only 3 minutes left, but I still want to give Sol to provide a last thought about the consequences of the inaction. So can you please share with your opinion?
Quickly, the version is listen to Natasha. Librarians need to be at this table. So I shared with the panelists that in my past job life, I've worked in libraries for about 7 years, and this was at the start of the internet. And at that time, at least at the institution I was a part of, the library was the leading internet service provider, leading champion of digitization. And I think as a whole, there was a missed opportunity by the library community to take ownership of the internet in ways that would make it a much better, safer, more truthful place that it's evolved into. Now, maybe not, but certainly there would be some DNA stamped in there that wasn't. And I think librarians let that slip through their fingers because people at that time were looking at the internet as a source of data, as a collection, as a big stacks of digital information that was growing. And librarians missed a chance in taking better ownership in that. So don't in this space. That librarians care about privacy and ethical use of data, not just instinctually, but as codified by the ALA and other bodies is important. That librarians work with a spirit of helping the patron all the time is important. And that should be woven into how libraries not just look at library analytics, but translate that over into the greater learning analytics conversations that are happening at the institutions you're a part of.
Great. Thank you so much I think that'll be a wonderful closing remark for our today's session. So We hope that listening to our 4 experts on learning analytics in higher education helps you better understand what should be considered when engaging in learning analytics. I want to thank our panelists as well as our audience for joining us today. If you have any questions about this session, please contact any member of the planning team. As you see, their names and email addresses are on this slide. And also you will receive an email with a video recording, slides, and an evaluation survey. Your feedback will be valuable for us to plan for the future programming. Thank you so much for your participation.
Thank you everyone for attending. Thank you so much to our panelists. That was incredibly informative, and have a great weekend, everyone.